All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Loretta Goodwin and I'm a Senior Director at the American Youth Policy Forum. Today's webinar is going to examine how research penetrates education, from the federal level to states, districts, and schools. Researchers and editors Cara Finnigan and Alan Daly set out to answer this question, along with other contributing scholars, policymakers, and practitioners, in their new book, which is titled Using Research Evidence in Education, From the Schoolhouse Door to Capitol Hill. Today, we are lucky to have with us Alan and Cara, who are going to share their key findings from their book about the uses of research in education policy and practice. Alan Daly is the Chair of Education Studies at the University of California in San Diego, and today is actually joining us from Barcelona, Spain. And Cara Finnigan is an Associate Professor at the University of Rochester. We want to make this as interactive as possible, but before we get started, just a few words about some logistics. In the event of any technical difficulties, you may dial 1-800-263-6317 to reach GoToWebinar's technical support line. Also, if you happen to lose connectivity, please just go ahead and log back into the webinar. At any point during the webinar, you may type a question for our presenters in the questions box on your screen to the right, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And we will in fact have several times for questions during this webinar, so please get ready to use that questions box. We will be recording the webinar, and the audio portion, along with all of the slides, will be posted on AYPF's website. When you exit the webinar, we're going to send you a very brief online survey so that you can give us feedback, and we really encourage you to fill that out as it helps us to improve our programming. And now, without further ado, we're going to turn to Alan and Cara for their presentations.
Thanks, Loretta, and thanks to George and Aaron, who are also at AYPF, for their help with this webinar and for sharing our work more broadly. We really appreciate it. I'm Cara, and we're excited to talk with you today about this book, and it's really neat to have people from across the country participating today. As Loretta mentioned, I'm in Rochester, New York. Luckily, it's not snowing yet, although I am told it will by Saturday, and so it's even with more envy that I introduce you to Alan, who's usually in sunny California, but now in Spain. So maybe, Alan, if you want to say hello before we get started.
Yes, bon dia from Barcelona, where you're all just having lunch and I'm toasting with cava. So it should be a fun webinar. We're really appreciative that you're all here to join us, and we look forward to sharing our work with you.
So I'm going to start by setting the stage for the book in terms of why it's important to understand evidence use in education. And a spoiler alert, although we are academics, this won't be your typical academic webinar, as you can tell from this first slide. Alan and I have put together a series of images that we hope are particularly useful in your own learning today. So what's the problem? The problem is that educational inequities remain despite decades of attention at all levels of the system. And the challenges in our education system have resulted from increased pressure to bring about improvement next, but a focus on short-term survival at the expense of long-term solutions. Next, along with the increased pressure to improve comes an increased pressure to use evidence to make decisions. But depending upon where you sit in the educational system, you have a different perspective on what evidence is valued and what evidence is or should be used. You also don't always have access to the same types of evidence, and that's important. And over time, a gap has developed between the knowledge that's developed locally, regionally, and nationally around educational issues or problems, and the knowledge that is utilized at all levels, at all of those different levels. And so we think it's important to mind this gap. In essence, we have a misalignment between what types of evidence are valued and what is used to inform decisions around policy and practice. Next.
And so this is a little bit about who we are and why we care so much about this work. So first of all, just to reiterate, we really want to thank AYPF, who have been incredibly supportive with us in preparing the webinar and getting the information out. And we really want to thank you, the listening audience at home, for joining us. We know you have a lot of choices in webinars, and so we appreciate that you chose ours. And so we really are excited about this work, and we bring both a practice and a policy perspective to it in order to more deeply understand this idea about using research evidence in education. We are early grantees of the WT Grant Foundation, who's been working really diligently and really deeply in this space around the use of research evidence. They were gracious enough to have supported our work and have done so for the last 5 years. And we've really been working in this space to try to understand research evidence, the definition of it, the use of it, and how it gets diffused in systems. And so in this book, what we've really wanted to do was to really try to take a different approach and take a more systemic approach to the work. And in the end, and next please, you'll notice that this work doesn't happen without the amazing contributors that we had that were a part of this effort. And these individuals represent scholars and practitioners from across the educational spectrum, each bringing different disciplinary perspectives to the work, which makes for a really rich and engaging read, if we do say so ourselves. And the studies range from classrooms all the way up to federal policy. We really wanted to take a very broad systems perspective of this work, and you'll hear this idea about systems come up a little bit later. And I think one of the things that's really powerful about the book is that we've really tried to link together these different studies from different perspectives, all with this deeper understanding of research evidence in education. So with the holidays coming up, we also think it makes a perfect stocking stuffer for people. So if you haven't gotten a copy, head out and get it because it makes for great reading. So let's give you a little preview, though, about what you're going to hear in the book. So let's go to the next slide. And so in the book itself, there are many themes that we cover and that the authors do a really nice job in covering. So we've focused in this webinar, just due to the length of time, on 3 that we think might be of the greatest interest and we hope will speak to you in your work no matter where you might do your work. So we also have selected these because we think that these are high leverage points for both thinking about policy and practice. And so you're going to see these 3 main images. The one in the upper left represents one of the major themes you're going to learn more about around translational issues related to research evidence. The second picture to the right is related to a theme about systemic interdependence and our interconnectedness and some of the systems work that we see. And the bottom pictures with the 2 heads with the brains in them facing each other, this has to do with another theme around evidence as learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to present each one of those themes. We're going to provide some background and general ideas about each of those themes, and talk a little bit about what some of the general findings are, although of course there's much more in the book. And then we're going to pose usually a couple kinds of questions. The first question will be a poll of some kind, and the second question will be a more reflective question. So as it's a webinar, and as Shakespeare reminds us, brevity is the soul of wit. We want to encourage you to also make sure that your responses to the questions are pretty short, because believe it or not, there's going to be well over 400 of you that are joining us on this webinar. And so without further ado, let's dive a little more deeply into the first theme.
Okay, so the first theme, as Alan mentioned, has to do with translation. And what we're talking about here are definitional, translational, and usability issues around evidence. So what do we mean by this? First, a lot of the different chapters in the book highlight that practitioners and policymakers hold a variety of definitions of what counts as evidence as they consider educational issues or problems, from empirical studies to local evaluations or expert opinion or popular press. We hear a lot about student performance data as evidence, but this work suggests that that's really just one type of evidence drawn upon at all levels of the system. Now, ironically, traditional academic research and rigorous evaluations are viewed as the most credible forms of evidence, but also viewed with a high level of skepticism because of the amount of time and resources involved. They're frequently viewed as just disconnected from the work that's going on the ground. And a large amount of research, on the other hand, could inform policy and practice, yet never reaches the hands of the policymaker or the practitioner. And when it does, people have limited time, training, and capacity to interpret the results and put them into actionable steps. Also, it's important in the book that several chapters note there are a lot of ways to use evidence, but most evidence is used either strategically or symbolically to sway an opinion or to confirm ideas. And even limited or inconclusive evidence becomes used because there's high levels of pressure to use evidence, and the fact that using evidence provides legitimacy. But also, different types of evidence are found to be used at different points in the policy process. One of the things that comes out really clearly is that evidence is used at the local, state, and federal level mostly to gain buy-in or support rather than instrumentally to diagnose problems and uncover solutions. And we're finding in the different chapters that internal leaders and external intermediaries or policy coalitions seem to facilitate the integration of research into policy and practice. And Alan will talk about that more in the next theme. But let's turn to the questions now for you.
So the first question we have is we're going to try out a poll. So here's the poll question. Consider or think about a decision you or your organization recently undertook. Did you or they, as the case may be, draw upon evidence that was 1, most accessible, or 2, most compelling, or 3, most credible and rigorous? Okay, so this is your time to play at home. So go ahead and make a selection, and let's see what happens.
So, Alan, the voting is happening right now, and you should be able to see those percentages. And you can just let me know when you want to close the poll.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. So it appears from our very quick non-scientific straw poll here that the majority of time that the decisions that get made are mostly made from evidence that is most accessible. And it turns out that that's absolutely the case. We noticed this in the book as well.
The other thing that we notice that's similar is that the most credible and rigorous is used the least, which is just sort of ironic, I guess, in and of itself.
Yeah, and so in undertaking studies of research evidence, of course, this is one of the things that was surprising to us from a research standpoint. But having spent time in practice, we often know that people are under pressure to make decisions and to get things done, and so they're often just readily grabbing a hold of things. So let's consider another question, and this one will not be a poll one. This one is where you have the opportunity to sort of reflect and write in. And so this question is, within your organization, what have you noticed about the framing of the use of evidence to support decisions? Kara talked a little bit about this idea about putting a frame around the kind of evidence that is being used. What do you notice in your own organizations about that?
And we have one response coming in so far, saying it informs policy decisions. And someone else has let us know that it is framed as what is most imperative. And framing is relevant to our most current work, said another participant. We also have information about ways to use data that is meaningful to their population. And the responses are flooding in right now. Framed as necessary for the use of resources. Policymakers often use the evidence that supports their preconceived idea. And I think we're going to be discussing that a little bit more later on. It is used to define the problem, not solutions, and as a justification for decisions. So Alan and Kara, I'll leave it up to you to respond as you wish to some of those responses that have come in from our participants.
I mean, those are very consistent with a lot of the things we found in the book in terms of identifying the problem, not the solution, or even just sort of a superficial identification of the problem given what was already believed to be the case. And so this gets back to that idea of, strategic use, where it's not used as learning, as we're going to talk about later, but rather used to promote an idea or a practice or policy that's already on the table.
I think the other thing that it reminds me of too is that we also saw this sort of conflation between data and evidence, sort of bringing these things together and then being used interchangeably, which also shows up in a couple of the other studies as well. So it sounds like the participants are really tapping into some of the core ideas that are reflected across the book in this particular arena. So let's dive a little deeper now into the next theme. We've talked a little bit about this previous theme around translation and definitions. And so now we're going to take a look at another really important theme that comes out across the work. And so one of the first things that we noticed across the studies, and actually it started out even in our intention to look at the book, which we intentionally decided to look at from a systems perspective. And so for a long time we focused on discrete parts of a system and what's happening. And now we recognize the interconnected nature of our work. That the things and decisions that I do, be it at one part of a school or in a district or a state level agency or even a federal agency, actually has impact on a number of others, sometimes in very unintended ways that we're not even aware of. And so this larger systems level idea, taking a systems perspective, suggests that our interactions and our relationships are really interdependent, and that our individual actions can actually impact the larger collective. And so this role between the individual and the larger is really a powerful one. So it makes me think of a very famous image. We can imagine a picture of Edison, for example, and he's got this sort of light bulb in his hand, and he's showing the world this light bulb. And while that individual light bulb, that creation was really important, it's really the system or the grid of power lines and connections that bring out the true potential of that single light bulb. So in the work, there's a suggestion between individuals and the system or the network in which they are connected to. And so over and over in this book, and also in our broader work, we see this idea about a web or a network of connections that influence the use of evidence. And these can be particularly important for those with whom we have a stronger tie. So if Kara and I are BFFs or besties or whatever the new term is, we can share information at a deeper level because we have a richer, deeper connection with one another. The other thing that we notice is that we notice that evidence is sometimes taken up or even discarded based on the strength of the relationship. And even seemingly well-proven research-based ideas get discarded in favor of those with whom maybe social influence is at place. So for example, Karen and I are attending a workshop together, and our principal shares some great program, and Karen and I have this very strong BFF relationship, and we walk out after the program, and I say to Kara, what do you think of this evidence-based program? And Kara says, I don't think so. I may be less likely to take that up. So our relationships are really important. And one of the areas that are particularly important is this idea about a research mediator or broker that Kara and I have seen in our work. So I'm going to try to explain that through using a very physical example. And you've been staring at your screens now for a little while at this picture of San Francisco, probably wondering, why am I staring at a picture of San Francisco? So let's tell you. Let's think about San Francisco from about 30,000 feet or so. This is what we're looking at now. And as we look at this map of San Francisco, you'll notice that on three sides it's surrounded by water. We all know that if you've been to San Francisco before. And in effect, San Francisco is disconnected from the rest of the land, as we could see at the top right of the picture, as well as the left of the picture. Now, we know that there are bridges there, but allow me to just sort of make the point here. So in a way, San Francisco is disconnected from the broader land. And in human systems, people systems, the work that shows up in the book and in our work, there are also islands and peninsulas that get disconnected from the larger landmass or connection. And these disconnected others then are reliant on other connections to bring them resources. It was as one of the participants said, that oftentimes these disconnected others are reliant on the perspective of the person sharing the information. So let's think about this a little more closely. We've got this idea about a piece of land that's disconnected. And so we know that in order to connect lands, one way to do that is by constructing bridges, right? And we know that there's a very famous one here. Next slide, please. We know that there's a very famous bridge that's been constructed in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. Here's a very early picture of that. And so when we connect disconnected others or disconnected parts, we have people that act as bridges, or brokers, as we call them, that connect otherwise disconnected people. Without these bridges or brokers, individuals, or in this case land, may remain isolated. Next slide. So once we have the bridge built, the traffic is free to flow. Ideas, communications are free to flow back and forth. But just like in people systems, these ideas can also be constrained at times. Next slide. And so communication can be clogged with unclear messages or constraints from the larger system, as illustrated by a traffic jam that's on the Golden Gate Bridge. The other thing that can happen is that sometimes the bridges get shrouded in fog and it's not clear what's passing over the bridge. And so in a way, this can be thought of as messages being filtered. So as messages move from one person to another and they are connected through a broker or through a bridge, those ideas can become filtered, and those ideas can become narrowed to the perspective of that particular individual. So let's take a quick look at a school system and to really think about this at another level. So next slide, please. So I'll do this quickly. What you're looking at here is a social network map that so from some data that Karen and I have collected around expertise, around research evidence in a district. So this is a large urban district, and you're going to notice that there are colored clusters around the outside of the sort of darker cluster of nodes. Each one of those clusters represents a group of schools. So it's a big district, so they've organized in these clusters. The folks in the middle, kind of the nucleus, if you will, that's the central office. And so you can see we've colored each one of the clusters by a different color. You're also going to notice that there are dots or nodes in these pictures. Each one of the colored dots, like the red one and green one and fuchsia one, for example, those represent principals. The nodes that are black in color represent people that work at a central office. You may also recognize that in some of the school clusters, there are upward-facing triangles that are black in color. Those reflect area superintendents who have the formal authority of helping to facilitate the work that goes on inside of those clusters. In a way, if you think about it, they are brokers of information from the central office out to the schools. Okay? And so one thing that you might notice right off the bat is that there's a different amount of exchange around research evidence in these clusters. Some have a lot of exchanges around research evidence, others very little. The other thing you might notice is that the nodes are somewhat different sizes. These nodes are sized by how much brokering activity a particular actor does. So for example, if we look in the cluster to the right, that's a cluster of schools at the blue cluster, and you can see there is an area superintendent that does a lot of brokering, connecting a lot of disconnected people. You can see because their node size is particularly big. We can contrast that to the hot pink cluster down below, which has a really small, it might even be hard to see, is a really small area superintendent that's doing very little brokering. And you'll notice some of the principals, the squares, colored squares, are actually quite big in that particular cluster, which means that the principals who are not in the formal brokering role are actually engaging in a lot of brokering around research evidence. So if we think about it, in a way, this sort of shows the formal system, right, in which we would expect the area superintendents to be formal brokers, and the informal system in which we have principals that are brokering information that may or may not be aligned with what the district is putting forth. And so these research brokers are people that translate findings. They often will filter what information gets shared based on their own perspective or own experience. And that can result in a narrowing of the diversity of perspectives and approaches that are available to do the work in the district. In turn, in places where it's working really well, it can also open up new avenues and ways of working. We can also think about intermediary organizations, state agencies, private foundations. They also can play brokering and research mediating roles. So that's a little bit about how we see these systems as being interdependent and interconnected. And I think we're about to have another question.
So yes, let's go to the next poll. We'd like you to join in again and answer this question about the research mediators in your own organization. So if you think about who brings research evidence to you or to other people in your organization that helps to inform your work, is that person in a formal position to play this role, or do interactions happen more informally? And I'll just take a moment to let you all vote.
Yeah, I think we'll let it run for about 30 seconds. We've got about half the people who voted so far, so in the last 10 seconds, we hope to hear from the rest of you. And we'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
And so that is somewhat similar to what Alan was talking about in this image from our own work, where there are some cases where people are in a formal position to do so, but more often we see this happen informally, just through the connectedness that people have in their underlying relationships with each other. Let's go again to another question. Oh, Alan, did you want to add something?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was just going to add the point. I mean, I think what one of the interesting things from the book and our work comes out is sort of this interaction between the formal system and the informal system, right? So the formal system about what's codified and what should be taking place, and this sort of quote-unquote informal system in which these interactions are happening that may or may not be well aligned with what the formal system is saying. So the juxtaposition and the play between the formal and the informal is actually quite interesting.
And Kara, just before you carry on, I just wanted to draw your attention to one of the comments in the questions box, noting very formal and that this is a huge part of the work that is being done at the Annenberg Institute, both with their research and the research of others. So that comment came in as well.
Thanks. Hi, Michelle. Yes, this is the case in some organizations that are really taking seriously trying to align these systems, as Alan was suggesting. But in general, we haven't seen as much of that, and I think the book talks much more about some of these informal ways that evidence is spreading throughout our system at all levels. Okay, thanks, Loretta. And so let's go to the question box now. We want to just have you help us think about, from your own perspectives, how do we build the capacity then for people to be more effective research brokers, given how important this role seems to be in connecting evidence and policy and practice?
And we've got some responses coming in. Bonita is sharing with us as a grant writer. She's trying to invite more opportunities for the formal systems data and information to be shared more widely. And a comment that Catholic schools have less formal structures and depend on the principal to be the broker. Christina shared with us to develop consensus and spread the message about what constitutes high quality research. And then also importantly, Michelle has shared that people need training on how to do the translation And we also need incentives at universities for more great academics to have time to do this work. And I'm sure you both have a lot to say about that.
Alan, you
We are
want to jump
so
in?
appreciative, Michelle. I was going to say this. These are exactly some of the issues. It just gets me reflecting that, boy, we should have just had a webinar and gathered these ideas together and put together a really nice book. We could have all had 400 authors' names on it. It would have been fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see as you all join in and build on each other how some of the things you're getting at now have to do with leadership, and this has come up a lot in our work and in the chapters. How do you find those leaders who already do this, and how do you build the leaders who don't know how to do this yet? So many of you talk about training, and that's of critical importance, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more too.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we'll also sort of touch on is that I think it's an excellent point that, you know, we've got to build this leadership capacity. We make a lot of assumptions that people have these skill sets, but in fact, they often get caught up in the important technical elements of their job and forget some of these relational elements that can help move knowledge and information. So these are all really important points, I think, that touch on these larger themes.
I think there's also one other question you might want to address from Myrna, if you guys can see it. It's, does informal versus formal affect the degree to which evidence is disseminated to the practitioners and how well they're able to use it? And in other words, does the broker matter in delivering the evidence message?
Yes, and Myrna, you're just a few steps ahead of me. We were going to talk about that in just a minute, but absolutely, the broker does matter, and as we'll talk about in a moment, because the trust between, and Alan mentioned this a little bit already, the trust between who's delivering the message is of critical importance. And if you already have a positive and trusting relationship with that person or that group, that often results in more uptake of the evidence that's being delivered in the case that you're talking about.
I think another interesting point on this too, Myrna, is that what we're finding also in our work are not only are these research brokers really important, but also, as we mentioned, they can filter the information. But we're also finding in our work that they are also likely people that end up leaving the system, which creates these disconnected individuals. Imagine, back to our analogy, if the Golden Gate Bridge was suddenly removed. You would suddenly disconnect a large segment of society. And so sometimes when these brokers move, it can really cause holes or gaps in the social network system.
So I think maybe we'll shift to the next one, because a lot of you are already tapping into some of the things in terms of partnerships and relationships and connections to build this kind of capacity. So the final theme we talk about is around the process of evidence, or what we call evidence as learning. And so a lot of people think of evidence as an input, a research report, student data, an expert opinion, or something that you're taking in your hand and doing something with. But one thing that really comes across strongly is that evidence is one element as part of a larger process of learning. And I guess put a little differently, evidence is part of a process that acts with and on evidence. So as Alan was just talking about, this is why the interconnected web of relationships is so critical to be thinking about, because that's really where the sense-making happens around evidence. It's through those relationships. So as you all know, the different individuals or groups bring different expertise to situations, and so when you have collaborative processes across levels or groups or individuals, you allow for this more positive and richer co-interpretation of evidence. So we, as many of you were talking about in the questions about how to build this capacity, we think it's really critical, and the chapters speak to this, that there are collaborative communities of learners, or what we call knowledge communities, to conquer these really complex problems that have been eluding us for so long. But in doing so, we have to move beyond narrow conceptualizations of evidence and provide the opportunity for people to grapple with and interpret different types of evidence, which really requires a deep shift in norms of practice in parts of our educational system. So, and as you were talking about before in these comments, it really matters, trust matters to this, who's giving the evidence. makes a big difference. And so part of that, as Alan was saying earlier, is people make determinations based on the person providing it, whether they're going to listen to it, respond to it, or use it. The same evidence brought by someone who's trustworthy or untrustworthy, whether it's a source or a person, will have a different result. But also there's a lot of politics around data use, and that's, I think, one of the critical things that comes out in the book too. Because of the current political climate, it's really very difficult to have a thoughtful discussion around what the data says or what the research says. And so instead we have more limited conversations because there's just the concerns of what will happen if the data or research says something different from what we've actually been doing in our practice or what the policy is that's in place. And as many of you talk about in the comments that you did, the leadership is just so critical to either building that trust or rebuilding that trust if it doesn't exist. And partly what we see in the chapters is that there's leaders can do this often by valuing different types of evidence at different times for different purposes and by facilitating the exchange of knowledge across these different levels and groups. If you could turn to the next slide. One way to think about this is that the types of learning process that we're talking about here is the result, it results in a deepening of organizational learning, or what's referred to as double loop learning. Many of you probably know this literature, and it's just very basic. Single loop learning involves a process that's like a thermostat. When the room's too hot or too cold, the thermostat turns off. And you can think about it as just quick response. Information leads to action. This discourages inquiry. It treats the views as obviously correct. It leaves out important facts, and it's self-reinforcing. But double loop learning, on the other hand, is the process that we're talking about. So it's a process of using evidence to diagnose problems and search for a solution. But it involves usually a modification of the underlying norms and the policies and the objectives. So the challenge is we need access to good quality evidence to be able to do this richer kind of learning. And we also need diverse views included in the discussions and a broader participation in the design and the implementation of action. And so now we're going to turn to another question for all of you.
Okay, so what we'd like you to do now is Kara beautifully described this next theme around evidence as learning, is we'd like you to consider and reflect on and respond to what conditions from your experiences support or constrain a learning culture around evidence. We touched on some of them, but we know that there's a wealth of knowledge and experience in our audience, and so we're curious about what conditions that you've noticed.
And once again, please just go ahead and use your questions box to type in your responses. And one of the comments as they're coming in now is the desire to continue doing things the old way, leadership that values research-based evidence. So once again, tying back into the leadership that you've been talking about. Trust, time, resources, lack of shared values or goals. The need for quick fixes. Systems want change now, not later. Elizabeth has shared that there's a willingness to change course. And interestingly, Arnold has noticed the fear of the results. A couple more coming in. Parental coalitions for typical grading. And a comment from Michael that says, if staff determine that evidence isn't going to be used, a learning culture is less likely to blossom. I'll let you guys respond now, and I know that you can see some of the responses coming in as well.
One of the things that, oh, go ahead, Alan.
No, please, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the things that comes across in many of them has to do with the conditions in the environment that you work in. And if you have an environment that allows for some risk-taking, then that and doesn't have fear, or fear either of not knowing or fear of what will happen as a result of the evidence being shared, then you're much more likely, as you all suggest, to have this kind of opportunity for a learning process. I also thought it was interesting how much leadership keeps coming into this again. When people value having these kinds of conversations around trying to figure out what the problem is and come up with solutions, it's also it has to be acted upon, or else it feels like a process that doesn't go anywhere. And some of you mentioned that in your comments too.
Yeah, I was really reflecting on the comments that were coming up around fear. I think this is a really, really important issue. We've written about this in other places where we've thought about this idea of a threat-rigid response, where organizations, school systems, any kind of organization, when they're under fear, they tend to kind of circle the wagons. They do the status quo, as one of the participants was just sharing. And when they need to be at their most creative and innovative, they end up being actually quite repetitive and stereotyped in the way that they do things. Stereotyped meaning doing the same things that they've always done. So this idea around fear and the role of fear in terms of creating risk-tolerant cultures and climates is really an important one. I think it also taps into sort of the affective level that one can feel in a climate or culture that might be in place.
Well, and linked to that idea of fear, some of you mentioned that there's this idea of quick fixes, and the quick fixes are not going to get us to the next level, unfortunately, and this is the idea of double loop learning. It's like that quick response, that quick change that keeps us within the things that we were already doing is unfortunately not really what we need. We need bigger changes to solve some of these complex problems that take a lot deeper thinking about what those problems are and what solutions can be used.
Yeah, I think this is really the case, Kara. I mean, when I was thinking about the part around double loop learning and then what some of the participants were offering, I think one of the other key elements that we talk about in the double loop learning is it's an opportunity to surface your assumptions and beliefs about the way the world works. Make transparent your theory of action into how you think the world works so that we can critically examine that and question that, right? Versus that single loop learning that you were talking about, which is sort of automatic response. So I think this idea about being clear about our assumptions and our values and our beliefs and making those transparent in terms of how we think the world operates is another key element of this idea about organizations really learning at a deeper level. Okay, maybe we should go on. We're mindful of the time here. So let's talk a little bit about some of the cross-theme summaries. So what we're going to do is we're going to now pull out kind of 5 core ideas that come from the previous themes. We sort of quickly flashed those images just to remind you. But let's pull out some of the core ideas as some takeaway messages. So the first one is that and we mentioned this earlier, of course, these are sort of just bringing to your level of consciousness some of what we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so here. And the first one is that people often conflate evidence and data and trying to understand those. And they typically draw on a variety of evidence, most of which isn't linked necessarily to research. And so in a way, there's a basic disconnect. Next. We also brought up this idea about brokers and moving information and filtering it. It reminds us of this, this picture from Rockwell, which shows the sort of game of telephone, right? That ideas can travel and we can influence people, but they can also shift and be narrowed and change depending on how they move. This also suggests that there may also be a lack of alignment between the formal codified system that we talked about, which is reflected in organizational charts or manuals, and the sort of quote-unquote actual way work gets done, who you call on Thursday morning to figure out what you should do. The next big sort of theme that comes out of this is that research evidence is often used as a way to frame the issue, to motivate action. However, it's not often drawn in as a part of the understanding what the pressing issue is. Often that issue just gets identified and people move forward without rigorously questioning how the issue is determined. And also including that in the development of solutions. As you look across the chapters, We just don't see as much evidence of that. Let's go to the next one. And the other thing that comes out in this work, and I think some of you have hinted on it already, is the importance of these reciprocated relationships between practice and research in some of this translational idea. And so often we think about this research practice as a unidirectional, one-way relationship, but the work in the book really suggests that the important, rich opportunities exist in creating reciprocal relationships between practice and research, with the understanding that knowledge gets generated in both places, and how can we co-design and co-create and make sense of what's happening in schools to support better outcomes. This also, again, reminds me of that, you know, we've got to face and front and deal with straight on our assumptions and our beliefs about things. Next slide. Clearly, one of the big takeaway messages here from our work that just jumps out at you is the quality of the relationships between and among individuals and organizations, as it seems closely related to what is going to be shared, right? So if I'm able to be vulnerable with someone else, if I can open up about where I am in my practices, I might be able to get to a deeper level of exchange, and therefore deeper levels of resources and ideas and evidence might be able to be moved. The contrary is also the case. That trust is one of these core resources, which if you think about it, it can really reduce the kind of transaction costs between individuals. Meaning that in low trust environments, as sometimes we see in districts that are under acute pressure, it's very expensive, quote unquote, to interact with one another due to fear, lack of risk-taking, maybe reprisal. So these cultures of a lack of trust can actually make interactions very expensive. Expensive it means in terms of fear and some of the other issues that we talked about. And so while we think about some of these sort of big cross-cutting ideas, we're also thinking about what are some next steps for policy.
So you can go on to the next slide. So the first thing, we just pulled together a few really key areas we think both in policy and practice. I'm going to talk about the policy ones, and then Alan will talk about the practice. And the first one really is just this idea we've already been talking about, and many of you have been talking about, where we need to build capacity in the system. And we've had policies right now that really focus much more on compliance at all levels of the system and not as much on capacity building. And we see this a lot even in our work in districts, is that there's very little cross-level communication unless it's around something you were supposed to do. It's not around something you're learning or making sense of or trying to understand. And in fact, when there is connectedness, it's usually from the schools to the central office trying to understand something that they were supposed to comply with versus schools and central office crossing over each other to understand some particular problem and diagnose the solutions and use different types of evidence to understand that. The next area that we think policy it's really critical to address, again, many of you talked about this already, is incentivizing collaborative work across levels. So we need resources that allow for this and push this kind of thing to happen. And we see some of this happening at the federal level, I think, right now, but not as much that's really going to allow us to have it happening at large scales. The next thing that Alan already talked about a little bit is that we need reciprocated relationships between practice and research to translate knowledge. And some of you have already talked about how sometimes it's hard to have access to good research. Sometimes it's important to be trained to understand what research is good. And part of this is having conversations between people who are doing the research and people who are implementing the policies or on the ground doing the practice work. Because when you have those kinds of joint conversations, you can get a better sense of what the research really means in different contexts. And now to the practice next steps, Alan.
So let's just consider a couple of these. There's many of them. We've just selected a few at the highlight. So one is this idea about building the human capital around evidence interpretation. So It's this idea about the importance to build capacity of educators, particularly leaders, as we've been talking about, and these can be leaders in any part of the system, to access, use, and diffuse research evidence. This skill set is a really important one to have. It also suggests that in higher education, we need to rethink and maybe retool the way in which we prepare researchers to engage with practice. This is a very different skill set in terms of your ability to co-design, co-create, sense make together. And I think the other thing this suggests is the importance for higher education institutions to reward and acknowledge the research practice research relationship instead of sort of the more unidirectional activity that's rewarded now. So practice implications could take place at K-12. They can also take place at higher ed and even out to the broader intermediaries. Next slide, please. And so while we spend time thinking about the sort of human capital, if you will, like some individuals' knowledge and training, we also have to consider the social capital and to develop norms of reciprocal exchanges. And so the creation of social capital is really important. And so it extends this understanding of capital, discussions around capital, which are traditionally, we talk about money, or maybe we talk about human capital in terms of training experience, but we also think from this work that there's this importance of relational capacity as a better way to link and create opportunities for reciprocated exchanges. And finally, in this area around practice, it's this idea about intellectual capital. So from our work and what's suggested in the book is that we have to move beyond these kind of traditional either or positions in education to be more about both and. We have a long history of creating artificial divisions between aspects of the educational endeavor, for example, like whole language and phonics, one or the other, as opposed to recognizing that there's some interaction between the two. And so for practice, we are saying that social capital is really important, but we are not saying that social capital should supplant the role of human capital, but rather supplement and enhance it for exchange of knowledge and evidence. When we're able to do that, when we can mix human capital and social capital, this may result in a new type of capital we can think about, intellectual capital, in which I bring my training and knowledge and understanding, and we bring our relationships together to create something that didn't exist before. And this, to me, to us, from the work we're doing now and from this book, this is really some powerful ground to be really pushing on. And the practice is for leaders and educators, and no matter where we find ourselves, to create the conditions for intellectual capital to flourish. So we've shared a lot together over these last, oh, excuse me, Loretta.
No, that's go right ahead, Ellen.
So we've shared a lot over this last 53 minutes or so as it gets closer and closer to Cava time here in Barcelona. But we have some final reflection questions that we wonder about, and we're happy to hear your thoughts and your questions. So one question just to get us going is, what's one thing that you've learned from this conversation, or maybe something it reinforced in you, or something that was an aha that you might share with a colleague? That helps us to understand what's really important to you from this work.
And while we're waiting on responses to come in to that, we'll also just prime you up with the next question, because we have another great reflection question after this. And the next question is, what from today confirmed or challenged your thinking? So once again, building up on that first reflection question. And we're getting some responses now. Stephen sharing with us, we have to check for understanding in our transitional discussions. Alexandra saying the idea of using research to define problems and make sure that we're not just assuming we know what the problems are. And what has been confirmed for Melissa is a lot of people are not or are misusing data. And Alan and Kara, I don't know if you want to go ahead and respond to some of the comments that are coming in.
I think a lot of people. I liked Melissa's comment that she's going to share the research and she hopes she has the social capital to make it happen. That's great. The idea of brokering, I think, came up for a lot of people, and that's been one thing that I think has been critical across many of the chapters, are the importance of either intermediaries or individuals, particularly leaders, really moving evidence through the system and helping with this process of learning. And so I think that many of you talked about that one, and that's an important theme of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so, it's been so gratifying actually to hear people's comments and feedback and thoughts, because it really aligns well with a lot of what we took away. And it's been really important for us to think about this work and to try to figure ways to raise the conversation. And I just feel so invigorated that we've gotten so many interesting thoughts that really help to deepen what it is that we found in this work.
Sarah has shared with us that she's been sharing with a colleague while we've been listening, and she says, I know she can train on research finding, and I'd like this skill for sure. So people are excited about being able to get trained. We still have more comments coming in. What it has confirmed for today or challenged thinking is the impact of human networking within a school, and a lot of Ellen and Kara's research has obviously focused on that. And Elizabeth has shared with us that I've never heard the term research broker, and it nicely captures a role that an intermediary can play. And she notes that she works for an intermediary.
So now you can make nice t-shirts at work.
I think also that one of the things that people are mentioning has to do with this interconnectedness. Even if Amber mentions, even if we don't realize it, that we're all interconnected, and it's true. And I think that's part of what in the book we're trying to help make sense of, is that these are systems that are interconnected and people interconnected within these systems, and yet we don't operate in that way very often. And with the political pressures and the accountability pressures in the system, that's even reduced some of our likelihood to kind of work across these different levels.
And I think related to that also is Stephen's comment that he says, I think we at higher ed need to think if our work really can inform practice. That is a good thought question for all of us who train future leaders.
And that really gets back to this idea of the knowledge community we're talking about, that having people come from different perspectives and bring different lenses to complex problems is really critical. So how people might inform their work might not be the way they're thinking of right now and sort of just pushing information out into the system, but rather co-interpreting the situation and the different evidence that exists. And learning from practice, I think it's not just learning from researchers, it's learning from both, as Alan was talking about, it's so much about the reciprocal relationships.
Yeah, and I think it just expands our idea about where knowledge resides and where it lives and how we can access it, right? It doesn't just exist in a nice building on a hill somewhere. It's out all over the place. And so how do we think thoughtfully, and how do we think together about accessing that knowledge? And then how do we set up and incentivize systems that researchers feel like this is a good place to engage the work, and practitioners also feel that they're partners in this work? And so I think one of the big takeaways really from us here in our work is this idea about these reciprocated, connected relationships that are grounded in trust and mutual respect.
Loretta, I know we just have a few minutes. I don't know if you want to go to that very last slide where it just gives the link in case people want to see the Alan and I have some different blog posts on the Shanker blog, including one we just have today. And so if you're interested in seeing also how we're trying to get this work out in different ways, I think that these blogs are kind of short information in case you did want to share it with someone else that gets at some of these different aspects of relationships and change.
Yeah, so please go and visit that site. There's just a great collection there. And we've also included, of course, a link to the book and more of our work should you be interested in exploring some of this further. The W.T. Grant Foundation also has some really nice resources on its website as well. And they, of course, have been very supportive of our work and the work of AYPF as well.
Thank you so much, Ellen and Kara, and I could not have asked for a better closing out statement there from both of you. I really appreciate everything you've shared, and judging from the comments that are coming in, the accolades, the thank yous, and the fantastic webinars, I think our audience has really benefited from everything you shared here today. So once again, thank you so much to both of you. And we also want to thank the W.T. Grant Foundation that has supported so much of AYPF's work, and we've been fortunate enough to be able to showcase a lot of the grantees' work. And so you can look on our website as well at www.aypf.org for a number of forums and discussion groups and webinars that we have done related to this broader topic of the use of research evidence in policymaking and practice. For today, once again, thank you for attending. We have recorded this webinar session and it will be up on our website shortly. We also appreciate any comments you could send to us via the survey that we will send to you as soon as you leave the webinar. And we really do appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. And I know Alan and Kara would love to get your feedback as well. So once again, thanks for sharing this past hour with us. We hope it's been an informative one, and we look forward to future webinars having you attend with us. Thank you, Alan and Kara. Alan, go and enjoy your remaining time in Barcelona. And Kara, I hope you survive that coming snowstorm okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll talk to you in cyberspace once again soon.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks, Loretta.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.